Despite protests in the streets of Glasgow, Scotland, the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, has ended with major pledges from world leaders that include slicing emissions, tackling deforestation, phasing out coal, and pushing clean technology. As a breakthrough, South Africa announced an $8.5 billion partnership with Global North to transition from coal to clean energy. Now, although key players, including Brazil, the European Union, India, Russia, and the United States, revealed fresh targets in the journey toward zero emissions, the question remains on where this leaves African nations, where the impact of global warming is highest. I'm Dimyake Mwakadielye, and this is Our Voices. On today's program, we'll revisit the COP26. We'll also examine some of the takeaways from the conference on combating global warming, as well as highlight some victories by African countries in their quest to create a better planet. United States President Joe Biden announced ambitious commitments at the COP26 in Glasgow. He also slammed Chinese and Russian leaders for not doing their part. VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara reports from Glasgow.
Stopping deforestation and restoring 200 million hectares of forest and other ecosystems by the year 2030, backed by close to $20 billion in public and private funding. That's the pledge made by more than 100 world leaders at COP26, the UN climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro spoke via video link.
Assumimos o compromisso de eliminar.
We are committed to eliminating illegal deforestation by 2030. I call on every country to help defend all forests, including with adequate resources for the benefit of all.
Methane emissions coming mainly from industries such as oil, gas, and coal will also be slashed. Leaders committed to cut levels 30% by 2030 under the Global Methane Pledge, an initiative pushed by the US and European Union.
So cutting back on methane emissions is one of the most effective things we can do to reduce near-term global warming and keep 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is the lowest hanging fruit.
With prospects for his climate legislation uncertain in Congress, U.S. President Joe Biden unveiled a series of domestic initiatives to support the deforestation and methane pledge. He slammed China and Russia for not doing their part.
But the fact that China, trying to assert, understandably, a new role in the world as a world leader, not showing up, come on. The single most important thing that's gotten the attention of the world is climate. Everywhere. From Iceland to Australia, it just is a gigantic issue. And they've walked away. How do you do that and claim to be able to have any leadership mantle? The same with Putin and Russia.
China and Russia reject the accusation and say Western industrialized nations are the ones who need to do more, since they are responsible for most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today. Both countries have aimed to cut emissions by net zero by 2060, a decade after the global target. But they did commit to end deforestation.
We take the strongest and most vigorous measures to conserve it. We improve forest management and fight illegal logging and forest fires. We are expanding reforestation areas. We have been consistently increasing funding for these purposes.
Climate activists welcome the commitments but are still skeptical.
This is the problem with a lot of these commitments. There is an accountability gap. Governments made similar pledges in 2014 with the New York Declaration on Forests, but they didn't lead to anywhere near the progress that was expected.
COP26 negotiations will continue until November 12th, but one major proposal, ending coal dependency, was dead on arrival. At the G20 summit in Rome, leaders of the 20 largest economies could not agree on when to phase out this dirty source of energy that accounts for more than 70% of greenhouse emissions. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Glasgow, Scotland.
For more on the Biden administration's new aggressive climate change agenda and reaction, I spoke to VOA White House correspondent Anita Powell, who says without the support of the U.S. Congress, Biden's agenda could be derailed. She also shared key challenges mentioned by the presidents of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria to fighting climate change on the continent.
It is an important signal that the U.S. is dedicated to multilateralism and to bringing about global change, much like like fighting climate change, which is a high priority of the Biden administration. But this is not going to happen overnight, and I think even the Biden administration knows that and has signaled that. So the fact that President Biden was at this very important global climate summit was not lost on leaders from around the world, including the 5 African heads of state that were able to attend. But it's kind of going to come down to the commitments, and it's going to come down to money and how much money rich nations can provide for poorer nations, especially those in Africa, that are trying to adapt and mitigate climate change.
Speaking about money, so President Biden did make a $3 billion commitment as part of the president's emergency plan for adaptation and resilience. What do you know about the breakdown of that amount as far as it relates to Africa?
Here's one thing I do know that's more important than anything about the breakdown. The president does not have the authority to spend money. Congress does.
Right.
The President of the United States has to ask Congress and work that out. We haven't seen any details of that at all. So once we see that, then we can maybe talk about how this affects Africa and who this affects, and whether that amount is even going to be $3 billion.
You mentioned the 5 African heads of state who attended COP. What was their message, and how strongly do you think they were able to articulate the concerns that they have around the impact of climate change on many African countries?
So 2 African leaders here stick out for me. They are Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari and also the Democratic Republic of Congo's Felix Tshisekedi. And they did 2 different things. One thing that I think is really important that President Buhari stressed was that, as we know, Nigeria is a major oil producer, the major oil producer in Africa. And right now the trend is to go away from this traditional polluting sort of energy production towards greener energy. And he made the point in an article, I think in Newsweek, it was an editorial in Newsweek, he said, I can't do that unless I have help building that infrastructure. We can't just switch to solar when we have all of the infrastructure built for oil extraction, for petrol extraction. And this is a very important point because these are developing nations that still need to provide basic services to so many of their people. Why they haven't over the last 50 years is a matter for another day, but they still need to provide these services, and these are the means that they have. This is the infrastructure that they have that will enable them to do it. So the point that he made was it's not enough to just say Nigeria go green. The world has to assist Nigeria in going green, build that climate-friendly infrastructure, and allow Nigeria to then build its own clean energy sector. As for Congo, this was some interestingly, I guess we could only say it's positive news. There was a large global deforestation pledge, and Congo, which is a heavily forested nation with amazing wildlife, amazing biodiversity, signed on to this pledge. So I think insofar as African countries are participating in this climate summit, they're saying, we're here, we're playing ball, but you have to help us do this in terms that make sense for our development and our people.
It's time for a short break, but first, do you believe the US, Brazil, India, Russia, and the European Union will commit to cutting greenhouse gas emissions and other contributors to climate change by 2030? Please share your views on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Our handle is at VOA Our Voices. We are also on WhatsApp. Our number is on your screen. Still to come, although African leaders at the climate summit called for wealthy nations to meet the $100 billion pledge, other nations on the continent are taking matters into their own hands with major victories in the fight against global warming. We'll have this and more after the break. You're watching Our Voices. Welcome back. You're watching Our Voices. African nations at the COP26 summit criticized rich countries for failing to meet their promise of giving billions of dollars to help them cope with climate change. But agreements to protect rainforests and slash methane emissions were welcomed, as Henry Ridgewell reports from Glasgow.
The world's wealthiest nations, the G20, account for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. But scientists say poorer countries, particularly in Africa, are suffering the worst impacts of climate change. Rich nations pledged in 2009 to give developing countries $100 billion a year to help them deal with climate change. But the target date has been put back to 2023. At the COP26 summit, African leaders voiced their anger.
Those same nations are, however, insisting that we abandon the opportunity for rapid development of our economies. That would be tantamount to enshrining in the global community inequality of the highest order.
Their appeals failed to shift the timetable, but the frustration was tempered by progress on other vital climate emergencies. Over 100 nations agreed to end deforestation by 2030, backed by close to $20 billion in public and private funding. The signatories included Brazil. Deforestation has increased in the Amazon under Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to its highest level in a decade, and some are skeptical of his pledge.
Mas isso não vai resolver o problema.
It won't solve social problems in our community where there is no water, where there is deforestation, where there is a river contamination. These are investments that will only give free rein to companies to keep their polluting.
Investimentos que dá liberdade para que as empresas continuem fazendo suas poluições.
Over 100 countries also signed a global methane pledge to cut emissions by 30% by 2030. Methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in driving global warming.
It's an incredibly important progress in addressing the climate crisis because we can now think about methane emissions separately from CO2 and recognizing that reduction of methane represents an enormous lever for making progress in reducing the rate of warming.
China and Russia, two of the world's biggest methane emitters, did not sign. There may be no big breakthrough at this summit, but organisers say the smaller, targeted agreements on protecting rainforests, cutting methane, or helping vulnerable island states all add up to significant progress. The absence of the Chinese, Russian and Brazilian presidents has led to questions over how effective the summit will be in curbing global warming. Host British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said he was cautiously optimistic. World leaders have now returned home. Their teams of negotiators will now decide the fate of the summit and, many scientists say, the future of planet Earth. Henry Ridgewell for WEWE News at the COP26 summit, Glasgow.
One breakthrough drew the world's attention to South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa even called it a watershed moment as the country reached an $8.5 billion partnership with the US, Britain, France, Germany and the EU to shift the reliance on fossil fuel. For more on how African countries can benefit from the UN Climate Summit, our Voices producer, Abby Sun, spoke with Katambi Kaari, a sustainability consultant with 15 years of experience advising governments, business and non-profit organizations in over 25 countries.
It speaks to the willingness of the global north to meet climate finance commitments under the Paris Agreement. Decarbonizing South Africa, which is a very carbon-intensive electricity producer, is also a step in the right direction. It appears to provide for a just transition, which would hopefully translate into green jobs and support for workers and communities. It also includes grants, concessional loans, and other risk-sharing instruments. which are crucial to de-risk investments, but also to encourage much needed private sector participation in climate finance. What is not clear, however, is what that disaggregation looks like. What we have seen in the past in terms of climate finance that's directed to developing nations is a huge chunk of it comes in the form of loans, about a little over 80%. And the problem with that kind of split is, of course, it doesn't do a good job of accounting for climate justice in the context of historical responsibilities, but it also, burdens countries with additional debt. With that being said, the outcomes for Africa really just come down to a couple of things: sufficient climate finance, emission reduction, particularly by the global north. We need to see more ambitious targets, tighter timelines, considering that Africa contributes about 2 to 3% of global emissions.
I think it's great you mentioned that African countries contribute the least to climate change, but bear the hardest hit. The British broadcaster Dave Attenborough said at COP26, this is a story of inequality as well as instability. So how would African countries balance economic growth and reaching climate change goals?
So the question of how Africa can balance economic growth and climate change really calls for a very compassionate understanding of Africa's unique circumstances. It bears the most impact, but it is also now required to pursue low-carbon pathways for sustainable development, and that's very expensive, right? In a nutshell, Africa's capacity to achieve these goals is largely, almost entirely dependent on the actions of the global north, who bear the historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. An aggressive phasing out of fossil fuels and climate and science-based emissions, because invariably the continent will emit a certain amount of emissions to build out infrastructure, to guarantee energy access, including using natural gas as a transition fuel. And lastly, of course, is the need for an ecosystem that can guarantee meaningful outcomes for climate change and human progress.
I think one important topic is the gender role in this movement. So how could African countries get more women and young generation involved in sustainability and climate change?
From a policy perspective, and in terms of tapping into the potential of women and youth, it means, gender and social policy, including for youth, that supports the inclusion and active participation of youth, of women in policymaking, in politics, in leadership, in business, in professional development.
Thank you, Abby. Now let's turn to some tangible solutions in the fight against climate change in Africa. Burning coal is the single biggest contributor to climate change. More than 40 countries made pledges at COP26 to phase out coal entirely by 2030 for rich countries and 2040 for poorer countries. One of the countries working toward this goal is South Africa, where coal currently provides more than 75% of its energy supply. But public and corporate pressure is mounting for that to change. Protests were seen countrywide in September, and now a proposed Chinese-backed coal power plant may be scrapped. Linda Givtosh has this report from Johannesburg.
It's what keeps lights on and industries running. But South Africa's coal energy sector is facing mounting pressure at home and abroad to end coal use for good. Frustrated with regular blackouts and the effects of pollution, citizens of the mineral-rich country rallied last week demanding cleaner, more reliable and affordable alternatives.
Electricity has always been a problem in our community. So our community members went forward and they fought for electricity. But when the electricity came, it came at a very high price, because we know that solar power is a better solution and it will be cheaper.
South Africa is among the world's top 15 largest emitters of carbon dioxide. Its reliance on coal stems from having vast quantities of the resource underground. South Africa's government told the United Nations it is setting more ambitious climate targets. While environmentalists welcomed the commitment, they say the change to the energy sector is not happening fast enough.
We have to drastically reduce our emissions and reduce our reliance on coal by about 80% within the next 10 years, less than 10 years. We aren't seeing those changes happening fast enough. We also know that we need to essentially double our renewable energy build-out plans. That also is not happening.
As the rest of the world races to tackle climate change, analysts say pressure from businesses and foreign governments can force a faster green transition in South Africa.
If we do not reduce our overdependence on coal, we will be punished by our trading partners who will set up cross-border tariffs, adjustment tariffs to ensure that their own industries in the home countries of Europe and the United States and the East are on level playing fields with South African industry.
China announced it would no longer fund foreign coal projects. That means a Chinese-backed coal project slated to power a new industrial complex in South Africa's northern province of Limpopo could now be on the brink. The Center of Environmental Rights that has fought new coal projects says the cancellation will be good news for the climate and for residents.
The people living in the areas where these coal-fired power stations are based are suffering daily devastating health impacts as a result of South Africa's electricity choices. And we certainly hope that means that is the end for the coal-fired power station as proposed.
Analysts say China's decision will also have longer-term ramifications for coal development in South Africa and across the continent.
China was seen to be perhaps the last outpost of finance that could be available for new coal, and there's nobody else to pick up this ball to finance this new coal-fired power. So I think the days of new coal in South Africa are over.
The prospect of cancelling coal is a major victory for protesters who want to see South Africa embrace renewables on a larger scale. Linda Giftash for VOA News, Johannesburg.
It's time for another break. When we come back, we will introduce you to a climate change activist from Madagascar who has taken a stand to protect her island country against climate change. That's coming up in our Women to Watch segment. Stay with us.
We're bringing women's voices to the conversation, and more than that, we're building a community of inclusion and empowerment.
Here in Kinshasa, campaigns to raise awareness against the spread of coronavirus are common, but getting that information to people who have no access to water, electricity, or money can be a challenge.
We are here at Kalerwe Market in Uganda, Kampala, where in this whole market, women are crying out for their situations to change.
For women, it will be better for us.
I think a big thing for me is just being able to say that when these protests are happening, does it turn around into policy?
Our kids are raped every single day.
This movement got the governments to listen. It really was powerful because it showed what is possible when men and women band together and say enough is enough.
It's not necessary anymore to climb on a car. I can be in any place to cheer with the people.
Welcome back. You're watching Our Voices. It is time now for our Women to Watch segment. In this week's Women to Watch segment, we introduce you to Marie Christina Kolo, a climate change activist from Madagascar and founder of Green and Cool. Kolo, one of 25 honorees of a Doha Debates special #SolvingIt26 project, which highlights young people around the world making a positive impact on climate change, explains her experience at COP26, how climate change is affecting her country, and what she is doing to stop it.
Climate change is not taking the attention, and also these two aspects on gender, because women today, they are the most vulnerable, and they are the most vulnerable group people affected by climate change. The effects of climate change are really different regarding gender. We know that in many developing countries like Madagascar, women are in the front line too. They are the one collecting water. They are the one, walking for kilometers in order to find some food, some water. And then when they come back exhausted back at home, they are not even allowed to rest and to take this water or to have some food, because we still live in a very patriarchal society. So, when we are talking about climate change, we are also talking about human rights. And this human rights aspect is not enough valorized here at COP26. Everyone keep on, we are focusing on statistics, on percentage, and we are forgetting all these stories, all the people behind, all the people back home, those who were not able to attend COP, those who were not able to raise their voices, those who are dying, who are suffering from floods, from cyclones, from drought, etc., who are losing everything, who are becoming climate refugees. We are not hearing them here at COP.
So tell me about you and what you think you can do to bring more attention to the impact of climate change in Madagascar specifically, and how it affects women also.
So as I said before, I'm a gender advocate. Today, I'm not working alone at COP, because working alone at COP, you won't bring some change. So I'm part of the Women and Gender constituency. That is one of the 9 constituencies recognized by UNFCCC in the negotiations. And thanks to this constituency, my voice is heard, because I'm sharing the same problems as a woman. I'm sharing the same problems as other women in developing countries, and also women from the global north. They are supporting us, they are amplifying our voices.
When everybody goes home, what next? Yeah. What do you plan to do then?
At a personal level, I will still continue my advocacy. I will still continue to be an activist. And regarding the situation in Madagascar, in the Deep South, currently we are launching a platform that will support and empower women's organizations from the Deep South, and let them share their own solutions, because most of the solutions today are non-sustainable solutions. There are we have food emergency support, that is good, but we need to think long-term solutions.
Do you see the impact of climate change in your community, especially among women? If so, let us know. We would like to feature other women who are fighting against global warming, deforestation, and more. Please share your comments using the hashtag VOA Our Voices. And that's where we'll end our show this week. Thank you to my colleagues here on Our Voices, and on behalf of everyone at the Voice of America, thank you for watching. I'm Dimiake Mwakaliele. Stay safe.
Masaka Nursery and Primary School inatangaza nafasi za masomo kuanzia ngazi ya chekechea hadi darasa la 7. Shule ni ya mchepuo wa Kiingereza, yani English medium, na ni ya kutwa na bweni, yenye miundombinu bora ya madarasa na mabweni kwa jinsia zote. Shule imeshika nafasi ya kwanza kiwilaya na nafasi ya kwanza kimkoa kwenye matokeo ya mtihani wa darasa la 7 mwaka 2021. Pia shule imetoa mwanafunzi katika 10 bora kwenye matokeo ya darasa la 7 kitaifa. Shule ipo Kipunguni B, Ilala, Dar es Salaam. Fomu za kujiunga zinapatikana shuleni kwa shilingi 20,000 au tembelea tovuti ya shule ya www.masakaschools.cs.tz. Kwa mawasiliano zaidi, piga simu namba 0713-322-737 au 0716-750-710 na 0762-085-152. Mitandao ya kijamii Facebook, Instagram na YouTube @Masaka Schools. Masaka Nursery and Primary School. Quality education is the ultimate investment.